Pretty much what motivated me to go to Stanford was I want to be a business leader someday, and I want to do it in an empathetic way. I want to lead my people in a very empathetic way.
Hi, my name is Amelia, and this is Leland. We've helped more than 10,000 people get into the best MBA programs in the world and accomplish their other ambitious goals. Today, we will hear from a recent deferred admit to Stanford GSB about his journey, application, and narrative. Make sure to like and subscribe for more insider MBA tips and tricks. Hi, DJ. Really excited to chat about your journey to Stanford GSB today. I'd love for you first to introduce yourself.
For sure, happy to be here. My name is DJ Fernandez. I was born and raised in the Bay Area. I'm kind of a non-traditional student. Both my parents they didn't finish college. First generation. I went through the community college route, so I began my entire academic journey at Chabot Community College out here in Hayward, before transferring to UC Berkeley High School of Business on a full ride. From there, I was really intimidated. There's that huge sense of imposter syndrome that like came over me, and I realized that I wasn't alone in this journey, and there was a lot of transfer students, first gen students who had a similar experience, were feeling the same way. It was really hard to network with other people because a lot of these freshmen, sophomore, juniors already have their quote unquote cliques, their networks, and they already knew a lot about the application processes for jobs like investment banking, consulting, tech, etc. So I started my own organization, core consulting group, which helped a lot of these non-traditional students at Berkeley develop um, via a lot of like professional workshops, having guest speakers come in, and we started doing consulting projects. So clients include um, Adobe, Tesla, Apple, etc. From there, we grew the organization to about 120 members throughout the country, through Berkeley, University of Southern California, Columbia, Cornell, and the California Community College system. CCG was my baby, and it'll always be my baby. And I was really happy to see how it's grown and the impact that we've made. So that was kind of really my first official start to entrepreneurship. My second venture was I got in a really, really bad bike accident my junior year. Almost lost my life, almost lost my hand. So I had to give up playing the saxophone, powerlifting. I wrote about this in my application, which I could talk about a little bit later. For context, I was originally a music major, and like saxophone was my whole life. For powerlifting, I held 4 state records. So feeling like I was never going to be able to do it again, it was really disheartening. So the doctors urged me to get into physical therapy ASAP, and it took about 8 weeks before I could see my first appointment. And I realized there was something flawed within the system. And through one of my startup classes at Berkeley, I we analyzed the PT market and found that a bunch of physical therapists spent about 3 to 4 hours or 2 to 4 hours each day just doing administrative work. So I developed electronic medical record system with my co-founders that reduced the administrative process time by 66%. So that was my second venture. We got angel backed. Yeah, it was a really cool experience for me, being able
Yeah,
to
that's amazing.
start my own company. And yeah, other internships I've had throughout my time at Berkeley was an advisory intern at KPMG. I was also a rotational supply chain intern at Apple. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. Happy to answer
Awesome.
any.
That dovetails really well into my next question, which is you've done so much and you're still in school at this point. What motivated you to apply to business school, and why did you choose Stanford GSB?
Yeah. So for context, Stanford was the only school I applied to. Really happy
Oh,
that. um, I think what motivated me to go into business school, um, originally it was for the clout. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. That was my original intention. But over time, I realized that number one, everyone at Haas or everyone who I met at Haas, um, they were really smart. And then the people who, we had a lot of professors that that came from the GSB, a lot of guest speakers that came from the GSB. They were super smart, but they were also very empathetic. And not to say that the Haas people weren't empathetic by no means, but I really admired their IQ as well as their EQ. And
Mm.
pretty much what motivated me to go to Stanford was I want to be a business leader someday, and I want to do it in an empathetic way. I want to lead my people in a very empathetic way. Additionally, I want to continue working in the startup scene, and there's no really better place to do it than Stanford. Staying here in the Bay, and my third reason for applying to Stanford, more personally, um, I want to stay in the Bay Area. I'm living with a single mother raising four kids. I'm the eldest child, and I want to be able to come home on the weekends, just like I did at Berkeley, and be a present figure for my family.
I love that. It's a really good mix of strategy for your future, personal reasons, clout like that. It's so relatable, and I think it's a lot what other people are thinking too when they're considering business school. At a high level, can you walk me through your application process?
Yeah. So as I said earlier, I think I think business school. I didn't really know I wanted to do it until until really late in the school year, particularly the deferred admissions. But my friends were like, "Why not?" So why not just shoot your shot? So that's what I did. I started my application 3.5 weeks before the deadline.
Oh
So
my gosh.
really, as you can imagine, it was really stressful, really, really stressful. There was more than a few all nighters scattered throughout that time period. So that includes getting my recommenders, that includes getting my test scores, includes writing all these essays. So I think with that, I spent about the first week and a half getting my test scores. I took both the GMAT and the GRE, so I have a little bit of um, um, insight on that. But fair warning, my test scores kind of reflected the amount of time that I spent on them. Uh, they were really low, so I knew that I really needed to shine in my actual essays. So I really took the time with each of the essays. I was already kind of familiar with the prompts. I read them, I think, back in January. So I had about like 6 months or 4 months to really kind of articulate what I wanted to do. Yeah. So since I was on the fence of applying, I kind of already knew what I would be writing about, but it was all really scattered. So I think it was about 2 weeks before my um, the actual deadline. I hit up Leland, and they matched me with Dion. God bless Dion, love her. She was super helpful with my application, especially with the parts that I struggled with, and she helped me organize my app, helped me prepare for my interview, helped me get my recommenders. Yeah, so she was really great.
Yeah, she's amazing. I'd love to hear your perspective, having taken both the GMAT and the GRE. What's the difference? What would you recommend? Any level of thoughts on those two?
For sure. Yeah, I kind of hesitate answering because again, I didn't get the best test scores. I For context again, I spent about 2 days studying for the GRE and then 3 days for the GMAT. So not a lot of time. So the
We do
reason why I
not
took both
recommend this timeline.
so the reason I took both of them was I was gonna take both of them, see whatever score, whichever I score the highest, and just submit that to Stanford.
Hmm.
So with the GMAT, I found it a lot more difficult quantitatively than the GRE, and the GRE I found it more difficult qualitative or verbally, right? Because you have
Hmm.
to write an essay. The questions are a lot more difficult. Additionally, with the GRE, I found that I was using geometry, whereas the GMAT it's
Hmm.
more business school focused. You don't really need to know that. A lot of the questions are more business oriented. I remember when I was taking it, there were questions on both on the practice tests. There were a lot of questions about like profits, costs, analyzing that. A lot of like more data insights question. Yeah. So
So if
so
someone is considering taking which test, what's your recommendation?
Yeah, so if you have the time, I actually would recommend taking a practice test for both of them and seeing you where you score the highest. So you have like a baseline, and then from there, just spending your time kind of working working and getting that score up. But I would say if you come from more of a quantitative background, definitely take the GMAT. If you come from more of like a poet, quote unquote poet background, like myself, I would take the GRE. The GRE is the score that I ended up submitting. I scored higher verbally on the GRE than on the GMAT, but I scored higher on the math section on the GMAT than the GRE.
That's great. I love that advice. Um, you've talked briefly about this, but Stanford GSB is known for very challenging essay prompts. I mean, what matters most to you and why? Tell us in X amount of characters. That's no easy feat. How did you tackle these essays, and what did you focus on to make your story stand out?
Yeah, for sure. So I mixed it between the past, the future, and where I was at that point in time, and how that the education at the Stanford GSB would help me. Again, for more context, the two questions are what matters most to me and why, as you said, and why Stanford. You got to fit that all into 1,050 characters. So you got to really balance how much you write on one of the first prompts versus the second prompt. I found that for the what matters most to me and why, I was really talking a lot about my past and what I'm doing in the present, whereas the why Stanford, it was more the present and the future. So
Mm,
for the what matters most to me and why, I really had to like sit down and think about it. There were times where I just would sit on my balcony just thinking about the question, just meditating on what I would respond with. I think where I stuck out too was my self awareness.
yeah.
So I began by talking about my past. I talked about my father, talked about my grandfather and my great grandfather, how um, they uh, they expressed resilience in their lifetime, and how that kind of came to me, how I've expressed resilience throughout my past, whether that was selling Pop Tarts and starting a little business in high school, to fund my music education, to losing 100 pounds and powerlifting, to starting CCG, trying to overcome that imposter syndrome, to building my startup. And I had to really be economical, very efficient with the words that that I use, because still had to save space for the why Stanford essay. And I kind of tied that back in as to why Stanford. So like going into my why Stanford essay, there was some hints of um, resilience in the beginning, talking about how I wanted to help make the Philippine economy more resilient,
Mm,
by investing in startups and entrepreneurs in the Philippines, to help build the digital infrastructure. So I talked about what I wanted to do with that. I think what shined the most as well was I name dropped a lot of alumni, and at the very end, I think I wrote something like yeah, I could succeed at any school, but really where the GSB shines is like you already have like these proven alumni who've done this thing that I want to do, and the demand for this thing that I want to do is only going to go up, and I want to continue following in their footsteps and paving a new path for Filipino entrepreneurs and startups. So yeah, I think that's where I think my application shined.
that's a great approach. I think that's great. How did you choose your recommenders, especially as a deferred applicant? And what advice do you have for other applicants on securing strong letters of recommendation?
Girl, I would say start early. I would say start early. I only had like 3 weeks to really choose these recommenders and help prepare them for the application. Again, Dion helped me out on creating a recommender package that I did in like 2 days. It was really. I would say that was also a big hurdle that to overcome, was spending time to really analyze the the instances that I wanted them to write about. So,
Hmm.
so the recommenders I chose was my manager at KPMG, as well as my sports management professor. I TA'd for him, and I was also a student in his class. Um, so for my advice, I would say there's this list on Stanford's letters of recommendation website. It's like a PDF. You have to like kind of dig for it, but it's called I forgot what it's called, but it was it was essentially like a rubric that they have to fill out, and I wanted them to delve deeper into those specific instances. So in the rubric, there was things such as problem solving, strategic orientation, self awareness,
Mm.
approachability, stuff like that. And I wanted them to write about it from the lens of a third person. If I were to write about my own approachability in my own essays, that's kind of it might come off kind of weird. I asked them to write about how, particularly the sports management professor, how I helped the students in the class, particular names, et cetera, how I did that. And for my KPMG manager, one of the things I highlighted was how I, bonded a group of interns together, and then we'd go out for tacos, and how like I helped unify the team on our project, etc. So yeah.
I love that. I think a lot of applicants get really stressed about the letters of recommendation because it's the one part that they cannot directly control. But I love what you mentioned in that you can actually control more than you think in preparing your recommenders, in highlighting stories and attributes that they could highlight if they so choose to. That's really great advice.
No, 100%. And just to kind of add on to it, at that time, I already kind of finished like what my application was going to look like, and the instances that I chose were kind of the instances that I didn't really get to talk more about in my application.
Mm.
For example, problem solving. If I wanted them to talk more about that, I talked about a specific instance, or I forget, respect for others. Have them talk about that. Commitment to diversity. Talk about that. So yeah.
That's great. And you do point out too that you do not have that much space in your essays, and you have probably done a lot more than what you can say in 1,000 characters or 1,000 words in your essay. So use these different parts of of your application, the letters of recommendation, your resume, these other parts to kind of fill in the gaps and present this whole person. And you can do that in a really strategic way.
100%.
Um, Last piece of the application I want to touch on really fast, which is the interview. Can you share your experience with the interview process for the deferred explicitly? And what questions were you asked, and how did you prepare?
Yeah, so I love my interviewer. She was great. Um, she Her name was Carrie. She also came from Berkeley. I think Stanford does a really good job matching you up with someone who who um, you have a similar background with. She also grew up in the Bay,
Hmm.
and we kind of bonded over that. How I prepared, I used Dion again, and we spent about 2 hours just kind of ironing out possible questions that they were going to ask and my potential responses for them. I think in that week preparing for my interview, I really got to sit down and think about my story and how I could articulate it in 1 to 2 minutes. You only have, I believe it was only like 30 minutes with them, so you want to be concise so that you could hit all those questions. It was a crazy interview. I had a bloody nose in the middle of it.
Oh no.
So, yeah, but it's all good. I followed up in my email. I was all like, at least you know that I bleed cardinal red. So so I added a
That's a
little,
great tie-in.
yeah. So I would say like being personable. They're not trying to find dings in your application where they're trying to knock you down. They're more so trying to find um, things where you shine. Trying to add more color into your responses so that they could say like, hey, we believe that so and so is a great fit for the GSB. you know so with my application or with my interview, uh, the questions they asked was a lot more scenario based. So after I
Mm.
gave that spiel about myself, talking about building CCG, Carrie followed up with can you tell me about those specific challenges? I told her about it, and then she kind of just like, I wouldn't say interrogated, but she kind of like dug into those scenarios even more by asking a lot of follow ups. So be prepared with the potential questions that they may ask based on your answers. You know, And then another question they asked, I believe, since I don't think they have my application, right? So, but they asked about entrepreneurship and how I identified a problem and how I
Mm.
approached it. So I think that was a really great setup because I got to talk about my startup, and how we raised funding, how we built it out, how I led my team, and she was. I remember I kind of gave like a light answer. She was like, "How did you raise funding?" I said, "I walked into a room full of angels, and then I pitched my startup." And she was all like, "Oh, there has to be more than that." It's like, again, they want to see you succeed, so be prepared to have a strong answer for each of those. And then the last part of the interview was the questions that I asked. And I feel like I really bonded with Carrie during this segment because it was the first time where, like, I'm asking her about her experience. Let me think about the questions that I asked. Oh, she was really big into steak. I got the offer LinkedIn. So I asked her would she prefer like pan seared versus like grilling on like charcoal or whatever. Just kind of to break the ice a little further. And then we kind of had a little debate about that. And she was she gave me a lot of her insight. And then from there, I asked her about like whether or not because I think people fall into either um, work to live or live to work, into either of those two camps, and we bonded over each other's responses to that. And then we just talked about the Stanford experience and how it differs from Berkeley. So yeah, I think trying to build that connection with your interviewer, I think that was a really good. That was a place where I shined in my application.
I want to highlight two things that you said at the end, which I think are really important. Questions that you ask your interviewer shouldn't be something that you can find the answer to online, first of all. And
Exactly.
second, they should be highly personal to the interviewer. And a lot of times, including with Stanford, you know who your interviewer is ahead of time. And I love that you did the research because then she knows, oh, he really wants to go to this school because he spent time looking at my profile, thinking about thoughtful questions that you could ask. I think that's really, really, really good insight into how to prepare for these interviews and the question asking portion specifically.
100%. And often, I don't think they might necessarily know some of the questions that are like found online. For example, if you ask them about like the acceptance rates or whatever, it could have changed within however many years they've come in to the business school. So, um,
True.
talking about something personable, 100% recommend.
The application process, the business school application is one of the toughest graduate school applications there is by far. There's so many different application components, and it really requires you to dig deep and self reflect, as we've heard. What were some of the biggest challenges that you personally faced in the application process, and how did you ever overcome them? One of them, I can wager, is probably the amount of time that you had to apply. But outside of that, what were some of the challenging parts?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, definitely time. Um, I think there was a lot of points where I was disheartened. I lost a lot of motivation when I got those test scores. I was like, bro, I'm never getting into Stanford. I have no chance. My test score on my GMAT fell outside of the range for the actual incoming class of 2024. So I was really distraught. So I think just focus on the things that you can control. That was something that one of my mentors told me. Like your test scores, they're kind of done already. I couldn't retake them. So focus. I just spent time focusing on my essays, preparing for my interviews, and making sure that those were stellar, to really outshine my test scores. Another thing that was difficult for me was, I wouldn't really say it was difficult, but it took a lot of time. It was really self reflecting and wanting to address all of the points in my life that I wanted to address on my application. I would say like I had a fairly interesting life and a lot of twists and turns. Going from a music major to business, and almost losing my hand and all of that stuff. So I wanted to create a cohesive narrative, and I had to like spend a lot of time, self-reflecting. I think what really helped me was I took a class on self-reflection. It was based off the Stanford class Touchy Feely, which I wrote about. Um, and it was called Leadership and Personal Development. So it was essentially touchy feely for Haas undergrads or Berkeley undergrads. And so during the journal exercises and the lab work, I got to really reflect on who I was as a person, not just what I wanted to do in business, but really what matters most to me and why, and all of that stuff. So definitely that self-awareness aspect was really difficult. Well, it took a bit of time. So I would advise future applicants spend the time, really analyzing yourself. um, it's a really introspective exercise, particularly for the GSB. That's something that they value. And it's I found it very therapeutic doing the exercise of self awareness and reflecting. So yeah, I think that was the two biggest hurdles that I had to face.
I think that's so important, and it should also set you up for success in some ways of knowing your story, knowing what you want to do, and why have you made the decisions that you wanted to do. There are a lot of things that it will bring to you personally as a benefit.
100%.
To wrap up, one last question: what do you think were some of the more unique aspects of the application that made you stand out to the admissions committee?
Yeah, I could think of a few. I would say, I would say, I think a piece of advice I got from, I forget if it was a podcast or a YouTube video, talking about the GSB application process, but it was that you weren't necessarily competing with everybody in your MBA class. There's different archetypes of people who come from a more technical background, people who come from a finance background, tech background, etc. And I really fell in the entrepreneur camp, and I wanted to highlight a lot in my essays the things that that would help benefit, um, um, not only my essays, those weak points, but how I could help benefit the class and contribute. So I talked about a lot about my entrepreneurial spirit, how it began, kind of in high school, selling Pop Tarts. I hired like 12 freshmen to sell Pop Tarts for me, rented out 7 lockers, and had like this whole system going to help pay for my music education. I talked about how I built CCG, built my own startup, my physical therapy startup, and how all of those contributed to the communities that I was a part of, whether that was my um, my transfer class, the students of non traditional backgrounds, or to people who suffered from major injuries or even life threatening injuries, and how I wanted to give back. The other thing was in my application that was kind of a weakness that I wanted to address was for these deferred programs, you're often going to be the youngest person in your cohort. And I wanted to show how I could contribute in a team with
Mm.
often a lot of older people, a lot of people who are more experienced and have done all the stuff that I've already wanted to do. So I talked about how I participated in. I was one of 12 undergrads that participated in the social sector solutions class at Berkeley, which is this non profit consulting class for MBA students. So it was a room full of MBAs, 12 teams, 12 undergrads, and then 1 to 2 McKinsey coaches per project. So I talked about how I was the youngest person in my group working for a nonprofit client, and I talked about how I led my own work stream and how I chose or volunteered to speak in front of the class as probably the youngest person in the entire class, full of what, like 60, 70 MBAs, multiple McKinsey partners, and I wanted to highlight that even though I was the youngest, I could still contribute in a group full of MBAs.
I love that. It was so strategic and it really highlighted what made you you. And I think a lot of times people try to paint this picture of what they think the adcom wants to see instead of just being themselves. And I love that you did that to the nth degree. Thank you so much for talking with me today, DJ. I'm really excited to share your story with everyone else applying to Stanford GSB.